A core reality in writing this chapter of the book is that the Philippines has become the epicenter of commercialized sexual abuse online, with practically 80% of our posterity at risk. Hello everyone, I am Archill Capistrano of the University of the Philippines, Cebu, author of this book's Chapter 13 entitled Sexploitative Human Trafficking in, Out, and Beyond the Philippines, a Liquid Problem in a Cosmopolar International System. As of this presentation, the Philippines continues to hold for 5 straight years the Tier 1 status in the latest 2020 Trafficking in Persons report issued by the U.S. State Department, a status that means full compliance of the minimum standards not of the UN Anti-Trafficking in Persons Protocol, but the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the U.S. that openly declares this compliance report as a diplomatic tool for aid giving. This annual report is educative of mainstream anti-trafficking efforts that adhere mainly to the criminalization frame. Yet, there are other frames to view trafficking in persons, alternative frames that elicit a different take on how to address this global issue. This chapter will describe them to you as it argues that sexploitative human trafficking is a liquid problem in the international system, a globalized cosmos characterized by polarities of hybrid forms and locations of power. As a defining specimen in the study of politics and international relations, power is typically understood as the ability to make someone do something that he or she would not otherwise do. In this chapter, I focus on a different form of power, the power to move, or mobility. After all, mobility facilitates globality, or cosmopolitan experiences for some, even as it endangers others in terms of displacement and, yes, victimization to non-traditional security concerns that include human trafficking. We relate mobility to what globalization literature refers to as flows, flows of capital, ideas, technology, peoples, or as what complexity theory stalwart John Urey calls global fluids. This cosmobility of global fluids tends to challenge the solidity of nation-state borders in uncanny ways. Thus, from the solid face of modernity, I employ the concept of liquid modernity by Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. In my interview about this chapter of the book for the Philippine International Studies Organization, I disclosed then, as I do so now, that I made an intellectual appropriation of this concept of liquid modernity from its typical application in terrorism studies, by which terrorists are viewed as global fluids. The more you make a solid grasp of them, the easier they slip away, and can engage and disengage at will, pretty much like the non-traditional security issues, including pandemic-inducing viruses like the SARS-CoV-2 that is giving us COVID right now. Typical solutions? Regulate or prohibit mobility. In the case of human trafficking, certain mobilities tend to be more free than others, depending on the power bearer. Bauman refers to those with empowered mobility as tourists. And in my research, sex tourists tend to come from the global north. Yet, at the flip side of the ability to move is vulnerability, as typified by vagabonds, whose typically challenged conditions induce them forced mobility. And they tend to come from the global south. An example, our very own exportable labor that the Philippine government consents to in anticipation of hard currency from overseas Filipino workers' remittances. Consequently, the locus of most anti-trafficking efforts are concentrated in the supply side, usually by stemming the tide of migration or unwanted mobility, pretty much like quarantines and lockdowns. This way, the structures of solid modernity get to reassert themselves. But my chapter questions, why so much fuss on the supply side? What about the other end of the pole? From this cosmopolarity, and inspired by my work not only in the academe, but with civil society groups, particularly the Children's Legal Bureau, I inquire whether or not there are enough efforts by the powerful to curb the demand for sex that in the first place fuels sex tourism and sexploitative human trafficking. Are these efforts fluid enough to address this liquid problem? More interestingly, are there efforts by other non-state actors that reconfigure vulnerability into power? Read the chapter to find out. Buy our book.